Hello guys, it's Chunker here doing another Beyblade discussion this time. I want to talk about God abilities from Beyblade Burst God. I feel like these are very interesting, as the Beyblade Burst God line kind of had every single bay have some kind of unique gimmick. While most lines had gimmicks on most bays, they weren't fully unique or brand new ideas, where they kind of had to be in Beyblade Burst God for the most part. Because of this, I feel like it just had the most interesting stuff in the series, excluding maybe DB, but that's why I want to talk about it. Also, it being the first line in Beyblade Burst to really have gimmicks makes that even more interesting. So let's go ahead and start with the first bay, of course, God Valkyrie. So God Valkyrie has a bound gimmick where this part can basically move, and while people would complain about how that actually made attack worse, it did eventually get the Strike God chip to kind of remove it and basically have no God ability, which is interesting. Regardless, the bound gimmick was still pretty interesting for its time. I mean, having a spring into the layer was definitely a new idea, and we would see more bays use the bound gimmick later, like Savior Valkyrie and also the Dragon line, especially with Gatling Dragon, so it did live on in some capacity, which is pretty nice, and it was definitely a sign of things to come. The next two bays in the first wave of Beyblade Burst God weren't as interesting, the first of which being Christ Satan. We had these rollers, which were just three small wheels on the layer. We didn't really see this gimmick go too far, had a bit of extra deflection capability, I guess, but that's about it. It would return on Cursed Satan with 5 somewhat larger rollers, but it didn't do much more than that, and it wasn't the most interesting, but it was still definitely a new idea, I guess. The other bay was Blaze Ragnarok with Stamina Wings. Now, Stamina Wings didn't do a whole lot, and we didn't see them appear on other bays, but it did become a staple of the Ragnarok line. Of course, when you launch the bay, these would kind of open up these spots for air to flow through, and it would supposedly give it better stamina, but I don't know. Now, later bays like Crash Ragnarok would make these metal, and then Goliath Ragnarok would give it 3, and then of course Cyclone Ragnarok would give it 2 very large stamina wings, which is pretty cool, but it at least became a staple for the line that it was introduced in, but that's really about all it did. Things changed pretty quickly though, because on our next release of Beyblade Burst God, we would get Drain Fafnir with rubber. These 2 points of rubber weren't much, but they were on 3 sides of the base, so they definitely help with, spin steel and whatnot, but Drain Fafnir would become one of the most consequential bays of all time. The Fafnir line itself would receive more and more rubber with each passing bay, and by the time we got to Vanish Fafnir, the entire blade of Vanish was pretty much just rubber, and well, with that, there was just 3 very small plastic points, and those were still covered by rubber anyway. That said, rubber was on a lot of other bays in Beyblade Burst, so this is where it all originated from, and it definitely did spread out throughout the entire generation. And this is really where I think God abilities started to show what they can do, because the other bay that released with Drain Fafnir was also quite interesting. That, of course, being Tornado Wyvern. Tornado Wyvern wasn't as notable, but it did have this free spinning ridge, which, having a moving part like this for the time was honestly really interesting. And we would see some other free spin parts happen. I kind of wish they would have done more than this. I really would like to see a layer that just had the entire outer part just fully free spin. We technically saw this on Lucifer the End, but that required sort of a mode change in some way, so I wouldn't say it was quite the same, but in some ways it was kind of an evolution of this concept, which is still really cool. But still, having a moving part like this that was also this large on a layer at this point was still really cool. We then have Alter Kronos. This was the first layer that included some kind of mode change. With this, you could basically shift this thing, and you could tell, so there's like these little spikes kind of sticking out here. This is attack mode. You could put it in kind of its defense mode where it was smooth. Also had kind of a weight shift going on. It was a pretty minor mode change, if we're being honest, but it did open the door and lay the groundwork for mode changes on layers, which became pretty prominent, and honestly, in Beyblade Burst, I feel like mode changes were just synonymous with the balance type. This is, of course, a balance type. In fact, the first balance type of Beyblade Burst God, so while this bay isn't the most interesting, it was definitely a sign of things to come. After this, we have Killer Death Scyther. This part can kind of get pushed back a bit, which was pretty interesting. It didn't do a whole lot, it just that this part moves back. We would see some other bays, such as some of the later dragons like Gatling Dragon that had moving parts that could impact how the layer would perform. It still wasn't the most interesting gimmick, and that was still utilized pretty differently. Just kind of having this part shift back a bit and just stay like that wasn't the most unique idea, but it was still a god ability. Yeah, there are definitely some god abilities that weren't entirely fleshed out or overly interesting, but it was still a moving part on the layer, still something new, so it was probably worth doing at least. We then get to Legend Sprien. Now, this did have kind of metal embedded. I'll talk more about metal in a little bit, though, but the main thing about Legend Sprien is that it is LR. This was our first LR Bay in Beyblade Burst, and LR became very, very prominent. Not only was every other Sprien following this one LR, but LR just became something that we would see in every single line of Beyblade Burst following Beyblade Burst God, and some lines even would have multiple bays. I mean, DB technically had 4 LR bays, so it definitely became pretty important. LR bays are always crazy regardless of what generation we get them in, so this was no exception, and for the time, this thing was absolutely insane. Now we turn to one of the funniest bays, Maximum Garuda. Maximum Garuda is a very strange case. The god ability of this thing is that it's basically just a gigantic circle. This thing is notably bigger than any other bay, at least for the time, and it is extremely round. I mean, just to make a quick comparison, you could just tell how much bigger this thing was compared to a regular bay. Yes, later bays would basically be bigger than Maximum Garuda on a consistent basis, but still, for the time, this thing was wild. And we'd see something like this kind of repeated with the Night line, with Aeronet coming out in the next season, then of course that evolved into Wind Knight eventually, and well, both of them were basically also comparatively giant circles. Though I feel like nothing ever did it quite like Garuda. This thing was just so striking for the time. Now we have Blast Genius. Blast Genius is a weird one. This basically had a kind of a deflection gimmick where when making contact with another bait, it can kind of move up and it sort of parry in a sense, and this would kind of sometimes just kind of stay up, and it would also effectively change the height of the contact points, which I find to be very interesting. I kind of wish we had more bays that utilized a gimmick sort of like this. I mean, plenty of other bays had deflection gimmicks like, I don't know, Helios Volcano, for example, but the contact points kind of being able to raise up in a sense. I think that idea could have been explored differently, or even having them drop. And again, I guess Lucifer the End kind of does that, but I feel like the contact points dropping was more of a product of the gimmick rather than something being intentional. And maybe that was even the case here, but I still think it's a very unique idea that could have been taken further. But regardless, I do find Blast Genius to still be a really interesting bay in the line. Now we have potentially our worst bay here, Guardian Kbus. I'm still mad about this bay being the way it is, since Kbus is my favorite motif in Burst, but anyway. This thing has POM chains. They kind of slightly can push in, not really, and then there's just small strips of POM. Now, it would have been cool to see more POM stuff, although that might have had a breakage issue, so I can kind of see why they maybe decided to not do that, but still, they did try the whole push-in thing a little bit more. I think they could have taken that further, but they tried again on Hazard Kbus, which went fine. But again, I think they should have done that in maybe a different way, but yeah, this page just doesn't really have a whole lot going on. Let's just go ahead and move on from it. Now we have Galaxy Zeus. Galaxy Zeus actually technically has a repeat gimmick, as Zillion Zeus is one of the 2 bays to actually kind of have a gimmick before Beyblade Burst God. Zillion Zeus had 2 metal balls, 1 on each side. Galaxy has 4, 2 on each side, and they kind of can change how they move around, but basically, yeah, you have the 4 metal balls in the layer. Metal balls aren't the craziest thing, but with more of them, they do make a little bit more of an impact on kind of the weight distribution of the bay. We would see Flare in GT have 6 of them, and I really wish we could have seen like a DV Zeus. Like, I wonder how crazy they could have gotten. Maybe the metal balls could have been sized up a bit more, but you get like 8 of them. That actually could have had a decent impact on the outward weight distribution of Zeus, and could have made it pretty interesting. But unfortunately, we never will get to see this, but I don't know. I really wish this gimmick could have got expanded upon, because I think Burst would have been the generation where something like this really could have excelled, but again, it just didn't really get revisited quite enough, unfortunately. Now we have Oricalum. Oricalum is a weird one. So the whole gimmick is that this thing kind of can push out a little bit, and by expanding outward, that kind of does make it a little bit better defensively, as it can kind of absorb hits a little easier, but Oricalum kind of has a second reason for this capability to exist, because when you take it apart and actually look at this, these parts actually clamp in, and they're rigid, so they can grab onto a driver. And Octa, Oricalum's driver, has these ridges. So basically, it acts as a second subset of teeth, which is really interesting. Honestly, I wish more bays would have tried having some more interconnectivity like this. Have some kind of layer gimmick that really plays into a disc or a driver in some kind of unique way. I feel like we didn't really get enough of that, and I think they really could have done a lot more with this, but regardless, it was a cool idea, and Archer Hercules would do a somewhat similar gimmick with kind of being able to push out the way it does, but didn't really have the clamp idea, so I don't think it was quite as good. It was still something, I guess, sure, why not? Now we have Sea Excalibur. Sea Excalibur is another kind of repeat gimmick because another bait had a gimmick before Beyblade Burst was Lost Longness. Aside from being a left spin, it was also the first bait to have a significant amount of metal on the layer. Sea Excalibur decided to kind of do that again, but this time had it on the sword and really tried to emphasize that on the contact point right here, which was really cool for the time. Metal would obviously become one of the most prevalent things in Beyblade Burst. The next line, show sets would feature metal on every single bay, and after that, at least one part of the layer would have metal on it in future lines. So metal on layers became pretty prevalent, and while not the first bay to do it, Sea Excalibur did kind of continue the trend, and well, we see what happened after this, so definitely another kind of important gimmick to talk about. Here's a weird one, Shelter Regulus. So when you launch Shelter Regulus, these parts would kind of pop out, which would also kind of force these claw parts out, and eventually it would lose spin, they'd retract, claw parts would retract as well. So it kind of had a whole thing where, you know, depending on how much spin it had, certain parts would be pushed out, and then as it lost spin, they would kind of retract. We've seen gimmicks like this that kind of use the force of the spin to determine properties of a layer, driver, whatever. But this is the first layer to do it, and we would see other things like this, for example, Garuda Raphael, which would sort of unlock when hard launched, and as it would spin, would raise up, which is pretty cool, but again, maybe this could have been expanded upon further in Beyblade Burst, but it was still nice to at least have something with it, and at least got some usage overall, even if it wasn't ideal. Now we have potentially the most striking bay in the line. Nightmare Longness. This was a layer disc fusion, and it could even accommodate frames, which is wild. We just never had anything else like this. I mean, the typical disc clicks were effectively just replaced with these dragons, which is kind of insane looking back. While technically sparking could allow any bay to be a layer disc fusion with double chassis, that was different, and it was also modular. This had the entire design accommodating this. We would later get disc driver fusions, but again, it was nothing like this. This might just be the most unique bay in Beyblade Burst, at least relative to the time of release. This thing is still crazy when looking back on when it was released, and I wish we would have had another bay like this. Would have been great if at least Guilty Longness could have done something like this just to really sell the Longness line and its finale, but still, even as a one-off, this bay is just great. Moving on to Ark Bahamut. Ark Bahamut started the trend of kind of transformative layers based on clicks. As it clicked, these sort of underneath green parts these parts could effectively block off certain sections of the layer's contact points, which is pretty cool. Wasn't really great on Ark Bahamut, if we're being honest, but the Bahamut line would kind of become synonymous with this gimmick, and later Bahamuts would greatly improve on it using things like rubber locks to really make the kind of transformation of the layer seem more natural, and just kind of did a better job at how this would actually work, which is cool. And this did lay the groundwork for it, so it is still good. Our next bay is kind of an alternate take on something we've already seen, but we have Deep Chaos. Deep Chaos has a vertical bound gimmick, so this would really deflect any sort of angled attacks, and even just straight on attacks, it still could give a bit of trouble too, which is pretty cool. As much as I like this gimmick, it wasn't really seen much at all, and I think it should have been. It honestly worked pretty well, I feel, or at least conceptually could work well at deflecting stuff. Fortunately, we did see this on Wind Knight, as its core kind of had a vertical bound idea, so that was good, but still, I would have liked to see it a little bit more often, maybe expanded upon further. I don't know, I always just really liked this gimmick a lot, and, well, it did work very well here at the very least. Now we have Sprien Requiem. This bay didn't really have a god ability in the sense of a specific gimmick, but instead had multiple gimmicks. It had a lot of things similar to Legend Sprien. You had metal, of course, LR with the contact points kind of being different depending on the spin direction, but also it now included rubber. Honestly, this bay was just a sign of things to come. Later Spriggans would have even more gimmicks on their layers than this thing did, and bays in general could eventually just have multiple gimmicks going on, especially in the later lines, so this thing isn't as crazy as some later bays, but it did lay the groundwork for them, kind of being the first bay to do multiple things like this bay did. And for its time, yeah, this thing was really, really insane. Next up is Beakin. This is another sort of click-based bay, but in a different way. Rather than having the layer sort of be transformative, it would instead get to a certain point that would activate a gimmick. This one would specifically work on the second click, where these parts now kind of come out and act as, bigger contact points, which is pretty interesting. And we would see this done on other bays, like in GT, Heaven Pegasus kind of had the gimmick where it became a bit more round, and also if hit hard enough would sort of heal clicks, which is really interesting. And of course, Sparking's entire special subline kind of used this gimmick, with that of course being the Limit Break system. The Limit Break base would get to a certain click and would have a gimmick happen. These bays were kind of underbaked though, unfortunately, and I don't think we need a whole subsystem based on it, and it wasn't really well made anyway in my opinion. But I just wish we had more things like this, because there were a lot of potential to really build on this, and I just don't think we saw it enough, and kind of forcing it into the subline that wasn't great, I don't think helped the concept very much, and again, just wish we saw it, and this was kind of the first time we saw something like this, and it was really cool. Obviously things like Excalibur already had it, but that was sort of lining up the, clicks rather than actually having a legitimate gimmick happen, so that said, it was a cool idea, unfortunately just didn't get expanded upon in the way I would have hoped. Now we have to a Nemesis. This is another sort of mode-changing bay, although an attack type, and I wish we saw more things like this, because with this, you'd sort of see this as like a downward, smash attack sort of idea, but you were able to switch the mode and move this piece around, and now it had upper attack. Again, I wish we had stuff like this, and we kind of did with something like Achilles, where you could use different sub-rings to block off certain things or change up how the layer would work, but still, I don't know, Twin Nemesis just had a really simple way of doing it, and I wish we saw kind of something else like this. Maybe use it in different ways, but for what it is, I think it was a pretty cool gimmick on, in my opinion, an undervalued bay nowadays, so I do still like it nonetheless. And now we have another favorite underutilized gimmick, Screw Trident's gimmick, Shock Absorption. We only ever saw this again on Poison Hydra, which I don't think really expanded upon it in the way I would have hoped. So for Screw Trident, the entire outer piece of the layer is actually disconnected from the inner piece and is only joined by these rubber parts. Now, unfortunately, I think the rubber is a little too hard, and maybe there's a bit too much of it. I wish we had maybe some thinner, soft rubber, or even just springs with a outer part of the layer that was even further out and not sort of close, like this is. It's barely even a gap there. I think this could have been really cool, and having sort of an outer disjointed part of the layer would have been very interesting to see. Would like to see how it performed, but still, I think that this gimmick was still a really cool idea, and I liked it a lot. Again, just another one of those gimmicks that was cool, but just never really came to fruition in later lines, unfortunately, but I still like what this thing tried to do, and again, I really wish we could have gotten more stuff. Even just another Trident would have been great, honestly, but I like it a lot regardless. And for our final bay, we have Duo Eclipse. I'm honestly upset that no one really seems to talk about Duo Eclipse. Maybe it's because it's a rare bay, but I don't know. The whole idea of Duo Eclipse is that it splits in half. Of course, it has two different layers. You have Duo Apollos, as well as Duo Artemis. These things have their own, god ships and whatnot, and you can kind of see the other halves here and where they come from, but still. Eclipse has its own special god ship, and obviously it is the fusion of these two layers. Again, I'm sad that this gimmick was never really taken any further than this. Again, it's just really, really cool. Fortunately, this was actually expanded upon with left Apollos and right Artemis, where you can make either left or right Eclipse, using a similar gimmick, just also adding in the extra dimension of being able to change spin direction, which is great. And later, Hyperion and Helios would also use this gimmick. And with those, you'd have different halves like rubber and metal, and different halves did different things. It was really cool, but I just feel like the shapes weren't different enough to really warrant any crazy performance differences between the two. Yes, there are differences, but I don't think it was quite enough. I think they could have gotten really crazy, add some moving parts, add some crazier gimmicks onto these different halves, really try to sell them, maybe even have size differences to where maybe one side could have been a bit smaller, which should maybe lead to like a crazier like contact point or something. I don't know. I just think that, you know, a layer that splits in half had a ton of potential, and while I did at least execute this better and multiple times, I still think they could have done a lot, and maybe even just had a whole line, or at least like a subline of bays like this. Regardless, it was a really cool gimmick, and just having a base splitting in half is, again, inherently interesting. Also, just as a side note, I really wish we got more recolors of these types of bays because there's a lot of mixing and matching you could do, and kind of sad we didn't get more. I believe the Eclipse bays only got 2 each, and Hyperion Helios just never did, so unfortunate, but regardless, still, this gimmick is just so interesting, and I just think it warrants more discussion, or even just modding, honestly. Well, there you have it, my whole discussion on god abilities. Part of this video was just me talking about, you know, liking god abilities, the other part was just kind of talking about how they were executed, and hopefully it made enough sense, honestly. I just kind of started recording and just decided to see where this video went, and hopefully it's interesting, but yeah. That said, I do plan on doing more videos like this. I want to talk about other gimmicks. I don't know if I'll do a video per each subsequent line of Beyblade Burst, or if I'll just do like 1, maybe 2 more videos on kind of just the rest of Burst gimmicks as a whole. I think I'm leaning more towards doing it by line. Obviously I'm not doing single and dual layers since those are largely barren from this, but I think this was a fun video, so hopefully I can do some more like this. I think it could be interesting, so let me know what you think, I guess. If there's anything else I should cover for those videos I didn't do here. I do want to strictly keep this to layers though, so if I ever cover like discs or drivers, that'd be a separate thing, but anyway. That's all I have for today, so thanks for watching, and bye-bye.